Well, guys, this is something that the life cycle of a healthy church is actually something I had read several years ago, and found out these stack of books that I have here. You can see it's ideas along this line of pretty hot topics. I mean, this is like autopsy of a deceased church. It actually is. It's a good short read. It doesn't go into a lot of details. Basically, this guy, he was the president of Lifeway at one time, Tom Rayner, and he interviewed several churches that had died. The problem with this is you can't find a lot of churches that have closed their doors and died and want to sit down and have a conversation about why that happened. Because, in all honesty, they have to look in a mirror, and they don't like doing that. But he did find, several people in churches in leadership positions or just general members in churches, basically wrote a book on autopsy of a deceased church. This is a pastor out in Colorado. He has a network, a Calvary family of churches out there. He's huge in revitalization. That's a term you've probably heard in Christian circles over the last few years. Replanting. I don't know if that's something that a lot of people think they've heard, or there's church planting, right? And then replanting is trying to go into a dying church, scrap everything they are, except the people maybe, and then start over. And that's replanting. But here's a book he wrote called God's Not Done With Your Church. Because a lot of times, and what he does in here is he's really trying to encourage people to start making the hard decisions, to start thinking about not what you were or what you have done in the past, but what is it that God wants you to do, and what are some things that you could be doing to address that. Flickering Lamps by Henry Blackaby. This book is basically the story of the church that he went. He was serving in a church in California back at the beginning of his ministry, and God called him to Canada to serve this little dying church of 10 people out in the middle of nowhere. And over the years, that church did not grow up to be some mega church, but that church was influential, and not only coming back to life, seeing people saved, discipled, and all that, but planting churches all around there's over a dozen churches this church probably has planted far, far away from their church. So this is a story about how that happened, and from that church experience is where he actually got when he wrote Experiencing God. Most people have heard about that book or that study, and it's one of the better studies I've ever gone through. Out of that experience there. This is a book, Mark Clifton, called Reclaiming Glory, Revitalizing Dying Churches. All of these books I have in my office. If people are interested in reading them, you're more than welcome to check them out or whatever. But this is a book that we used in Illinois, handed it out to every pastor and church members that wanted it, to help them kind of take a step back and look at themselves honestly. And where are they? And that's kind of what this life cycle I'm going to be talking about earlier is going to help us be able to identify some things that might be able to kind of pinpoint where we are or where we think we are, because that's a huge thing. When I would sit down with many pastors, there was one pastor, and I'm not going to mention any names since we're recording this. They can figure it out if they were to watch it, but no. But there was a pastor in Illinois who, when he came to that church like 20 years ago, he had about 185 people on average in worship service. By the time I got to Illinois, he was down to 25 people in worship service. And by the time I left, they were down to 10 to 12. Slowly and when I would talk to him, he would say things, like, man, we're just a little church that could. And I would always ask, could what? You're dying. And you could do that, but could do what? And so, he read this and just did not see himself in it at all. And there were several churches. We had one church in Illinois that did eventually close their doors because of that. And I've actually predicted that in the next 5 years, well now 4 years, there'll be 2 others that are going to follow them in closing their doors. This is a book just called The Reclaimed Church: How Churches Grow, Decline, and Experience Revitalization. Again, a lot of this stuff is similar material, but I'm just showing you these things because the volume, what I have is like less than 1% of actual material that's out there. Replant Roadmap, this is more of a guide for a church that wanted to come alongside a dying church and help them come to life. This actually has like game plans that you could look into whatever context they find themselves, whether they're rural or urban, or where they are in decline and leadership and all that kind of stuff. This is like a serious roadmap, guidebook to help you start wherever they are and give them, okay, your next step is this, and your next step is this, and this is our next step, help you, kind of thing. And then the last one is revision. We won't necessarily get into this. If you're really into scholastic stuff, I mean, this honestly, it took me a while to read this book because I had to put it down and walk away and kind of absorb it. And now, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, so it takes me a little while to absorb stuff. But yeah, this stuff has all sorts of statistics and history and all sorts of things in it, and it's a good book. But it is mainly talking about the first steps in decline and what happens with the church as far as vision goes, and thus the name Revision. And so when you see by just those books right there, those are just a handful of books out of my bookcase that talk about revitalization, replanting, revisioning, dying churches, life cycles. All those various things are really kind of the same thing. And so when I came off the field, we didn't hear about this stuff overseas. And so when I came off the field and started hearing these terms, I just started picking out asking pastors what books they read, and I started reading on some things. And realized that there was one document that I got hold of that just said a lot. And I am more than willing just to send that document to you. If you want it afterwards, you just tell me and I'll send it to you. But it is a document on... it's from this particular guy that wrote this. This is a chart that he has in his document. Now, let me just show you this. These are other books that have similar charts, the whole life cycle thing. This is Robert Dale's To Dream Again, John Piper's Breakthrough to Creative Change, Tony Morgan's The Unstuck Church, Life Cycle of the Church by Greg Wings. You can start seeing there's some similarities. The reason I like this one here is because it's not just a pure arch. It has steps. Because there are many times what I've discovered in churches that churches are making growth. They're making growth. They're moving up. Is that the right word? Yeah, they're moving up. I was looking at through the paper here, and it could be that they get right here and start downward trend from here, instead of moving up through the cycle and going down. There's several places we can start turning downward. We'll get into some of this stuff here in a little bit. But think about one of the things that I thought about when I sit down with pastors and go over this in Illinois, I would say, our bodies, each of us in our bodies, this body is we were born and we're growing up and we're at various stages in our life cycle, right? I'm further toward the end than you guys are. And so, there's going to be a point when this body just dies. And it's going to die earlier than if I don't take care of myself, right? If I just make silly decisions, stupid decisions, just not take care of myself for long term. But ultimately, when men are thinking about their life early on, they have kind of these goals that American culture has kind of put on, right? It's like, okay, I need to get an education, I need to get a job, I need to find a good woman and marry, we need to have some kids, get a house, and provide for the family and all those things. And then ultimately there comes a time when you're at the kids are out of the house and you have to kind of ask yourself, now what? And there's a lot of men that once the kids are out of the house, they're like going, now what? And so they're in a place where churches get to that place where they have to start revisioning their life, where they have to start evaluating their life and realizing, I can keep going down this track I'm on, or I can decide, okay, I need to do something different here. Churches are the exact same way. Churches have to constantly be evaluating where we are, what we're doing. And that's what staff does. There's no way that this is something we're putting on you guys. What I want to show you, this came out of a conversation we had in a staff meeting. And, a couple of guys in that staff meeting just said, I think this is something the church would like to hear. And so want to share with you just some things, because this life cycle and these things that we're going to be talking about that are indicators along the life cycle are going to help us be able to determine, because I'm not as concerned about living hope. I've been here a little over a year now, and I'm not as concerned about living hope, but I also know that living hope can be a catalyst or a mobilizer in some struggling churches around us. And if we understand this kind of indicators in life cycle, then we're going to be better prepared as we go in and help churches figure out where they are and how to take some of the next steps. So what I want to do now is just and there's actually some paper right there and pens if y'all don't have your own stuff. You're more than welcome to get it if you want to. You don't have to. Okay, these are going to be the indicators that we're looking at. The first one here is vision. Vision, that is something, that's when you get started doing, you've got a vision, you've got core beliefs, you've got goals, you've got, this is who we are, mission statements, whatever you want to call it. That's kind of the early onset of when you're birthing a church, when you're starting a church. Vision is where you begin. Okay, and the next one is relationship. And when we use the word relationship here, not only does this gentleman here, now he wrote this document I have is actually a paper, part of a paper he wrote for his doctoral thesis 20 years ago. George Bullard's his name. He actually is a director of missions in South Carolina right now. And he has tweaked this just a little bit, not much. And that's what I like about it, is he's constantly going back tweaking some of this stuff. All that other stuff I showed you, that stuff has come out in the last probably 5 years. His stuff has been around for like 20 years, and he tweaks it and he keeps it up, and that's one of the reasons why I like. But relationships, when he talks about relationships, he's not talking about just hanging out or getting to know each other. In that, he's talking about, when we have these, it's right relationships not only with Christ, but with each other. How are we taking our vision and importing it into our relationships? Okay, so it's just not, let's go to the ball game, let's go out to eat, let's hang out in our homes and play games and stuff like that. Please don't hear me say there's something wrong with that. That's not what, I'm not here to judge those things. What I'm saying is, when he talks about relationships here, this is where, and one key thing he says here is, this is the key word for how we do discipleship. Okay? It's in relationship. Again, it's not that you can't do discipleship in a big class. Alan will tell you in the worship service, there is an element of discipleship in a worship service. All right? When he's up there teaching the church, there is an element of taking the scriptures, sharing it with the people, and in all honesty, that's where it stops. Outside of the work of the Holy Spirit, how do we know these things are going to happen? Because there's really not much as far as relationship and community. How is our community coming alongside them? Is there accountability built into it? Can other people get up there and do what Alan does in front of, like this morning we had almost 200 people in there. Can other people stand up in front of 200 people and just share, the way Alan does week in and week out? It's really not that reproducible. And so although there are elements of discipleship in a worship service, that's not discipleship. Okay? And it's the same way as we break it down into smaller groups. Discipleship happens when we are interacting with each other relationally and personally. Because even Henry Blackaby will say, like in Experiencing God, it's a really good book, but if you're doing it in a classroom, if this place was full of people and we're going through Experiencing God right now, we'll learn a lot, but it's not discipleship. Because that would mean every week I would get together with 2 or 3 guys and sit down with them. Okay, this last week, this is what we learned. How did that challenge us? How does that change us? What are the things that we need to switch gears in our life and come and line ourselves up alongside of the way God is moving? That's when discipleship truly happens. So I want us to get that idea of what discipleship truly is. It's in relationship. It's not a part of this third part, which is programs. Or programming, whatever you want to call Programming is where you start introducing like organized ministries. Now, let me say this. Just because I differentiated relationships and programming like I did, again, it doesn't mean this is a bad thing. It has to be what we want to see, and we'll see it here in a little bit. There has to be the right emphasis on things, and there has to be the right order on all these things. And so when we're looking at programming, that's where we're coming across. And what is our focus in a worship service? You know, when the staff comes together, we're talking about the worship service. You know, when COVID came around, the worship service got tweaked, didn't it? I mean, it changed a little bit. Who knows when it changed in some churches, when it went from hymn only and the big pipe organ to a hymn and a praise song, a couple of hymns and a praise song, and who in the world invited that guy up there with the guitar? And then, you know, all of a sudden it's, you know, got drums and keyboards and guitars and all sorts of things going on up there, and there's not a hymn being sung at all. So there's transitions, and again, it's not a good or bad thing, it's just that's the way things are changing. That's the way we decide on programming. What does that look like? Youth ministries, children ministries, all these various things, what do they look like? And again, more importantly, how are they driven by the vision? And how are they driven by relationship? Let's just say a couple of us, let's just say the three of us are in this room and we're overseeing, you know, we're helping out with the college and young adults, and we got all these ideas. We just brainstormed and come up with a whole bunch of, we got 25 ideas about how to fill a calendar and how to meet needs and how to do all this kind of stuff. Our next question should be, which of these line up with the vision of the church? Instead of, oh man, this is going to be cool, let's go to this, they're going to have fun at this. Or they're going to get entertained at this. Or they're going to get challenged at this. Challenged in what way? Are we ready for them to be challenged in that way? Do we need to build up to something like that? And so it's driven by this. The last thing here is management. Some folks say maintenance. That's where you start having things like constitution bylaws, budgets. What's another one we can think of that might go into that? You might even want to throw in their traditions, you know, as long as that doesn't take priority over the vision or the relationship or whatever. And so we've got these 4 indicators that we want to keep in mind as we're thinking about what the life cycle of a church looks like. Now, I'm not going to get into the plateaus I'm just going to draw a simple arch. And you guys are going to figure out pretty quick how this comes together. Because when you start off at the beginning of a church, before I get started on this, are there any questions about this? Any thoughts? Anybody want to argue with these guys that wrote these books about this? Because I promise you, none of this is my ideas, okay? These are things I've learned over the last 5 or 6 years that have helped me understand what happened when I was in Connecticut. What happened when I was in Maine? What happened with a handful of churches when I was in Illinois? And even thinking back, man, so that explains what happened at my college church. That explains what happened at, you know, whatever it is. And even overseas, that explains what happened in that international church that we were a part of over there. There was a lot of things that have happened around us that helped me understand why things happened, why there were hiccups along the way, as we look at this. So everybody's got a good grasp on what these things are. So at the very beginning, we start off with vision. When everything is birthed, let's just say we're a core group of people. We want to start a church. We're going to sit down and say, who are we? What do we want to do? You know, and a lot of people will come up with things like, we want to be a church that we want to be a church that takes seriously the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. You know, probably 90% of the churches have that somewhere built into their vision statement. And there's nothing wrong with that. There really isn't. It's biblical, right? As a matter of fact, I think this church has it in their structure document. There's something about the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. There's one other verse, I think it's 1 Corinthians 10:31. is whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. It's all of these things, which is one of the reasons why, when Alan, he's talking about be a disciple, make disciples, be the church. Have you noticed lately he's added that to the glory of God thing in there? Well, part of that is because as we sit down and started looking at the old structure document, we saw that in there and said, man, that's a good way to wrap that, to kind of tie it together. We can act like we're making disciples, being disciples, and being the church and all that, but if it's not to the glory of God, it's because of a manuscript we read, or this is just the staff's preference in how we do this, or whatever. And Henry Blackaby and his church, Flickering Lamps, that church in Canada, that church, like I said, never did get big. But it was incredibly influential. Once they got a grasp on what it meant to be a church that was focusing on the glory of God and how they could be a part of what God is doing around them. They never got to be a huge church. They never had a big budget. But they were influential. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that church was influential in seeing a Canadian seminary start up there, which is a very strong seminary nowadays. So, church starts off with a vision, and there is a little bit of this kind of element, because you're not going to sit down and start off with, you're not going to sit down and start off with a new church. We're going to sit, and Jen might say, okay, so what's the budget? Well, we're not going to talk about budgets right now. Well, what about, some of the, are we going to do any children's stuff? We're not really talking about that stuff right now. Those things are still important, but they're minimized. And so we're going to use a little R, a little D, and a little M to kind of show that they're a part of the process, they're a part of the plan, but at first, we just want to drive home this vision. And we want to buy into it ourselves, because there's a lot of church plants out there that will get started and they'll lose themselves in the growth, because church plants, one of the reasons why we see so many church plants is because they grow faster than established churches. It's just something about a new church starting and new blood, new excitement, new things. They're not afraid to try something new, and they get in there into a community that needs a church, and next thing you know, they go from 10, 12, 15 people, and within a year they got over 100. And you don't see that kind of exponential type growth in other churches. And so there are a lot of churches out there that's their church growth strategy, is let's go out and plant another church. Let's go out and plant another church. And that's a fine strategy. If you want to go that route, there's nothing wrong with that. The second part is when you're actually launching, the relationships come into play. And this is really what this is the discipleship element. If I was a pastor and we were, coming together to start a church or anything like that, I would want to make sure that we were all on the same page in not just in starting this church, but in how we're going to do it long term. And so I'd be spending time one-on-one or as a group together. And that's why you see a lot of times these church planters, they're meeting people in coffee houses and homes, in rented facilities that they might be using. They're just meeting with the core group in different layers, different elements, making sure that those who are in charge of the worship side of it on the same page. Those who are in charge of the children's side of it on the same page. Those who are in charge of the, discipleship tool on the same page. So he's doing this, but he's not just doing this on a program or a management level. He's doing this on a discipleship level. Because what he's ultimately doing with you is what he hopes that sometime down the road, when there is a chance that the church might start another church, you will do the same thing there. Does that make sense? The DNA, he wants to make sure that DNA, whatever we start with, remains there, and he has to spend time early on making sure that happens. And that is a discipleship element. It is a theological element. It is a doctrinal element in making sure that, because we just don't want to have a church that's going to attract people. I might get in trouble for this one, but one guy asked me about I just want to know. We're just ready to try, to get people into the church and just get them in the door. That's all we want to do, is just get them in the door. And I knew that, man, if you get some people in this door, it's no better than getting them into Joel Osteen's church or anything like that. It's just it was dying. I've actually been in that church, and when I'm the youngest guy in the room, there's a problem. And so I'm in here, I'm the youngest guy in the room, and they just want young people and they want their money. And so they're trying to figure out a way. And I'm sitting in a meeting once and listening to them going back and forth, coming up with all these ideas of attracting people. And one guy said, David, do you have any ideas about how we might be able to attract people? And I said, man, if you get you a bunch of hooter girls going up and down the aisle taking orders, you'll get a whole lot of people coming to church. And of course, they were shocked that I would even think like that. And I put it back on them and says, all you guys are talking about is attracting people. That is a way, it's not a good way, but there's no difference in doing that than handing out candy to people walking into the door or giving them some kind of incentive just to walk through the door. We don't want to be that kind of church. We want to make sure that our vision is to, in relationship, go and make disciples. And how do we go about doing that? We interact with a lost world out there, with our neighbors, our coworkers, whoever they might be. We interact that way. And our goal is to, yes, be friends with them and get to know them better and all that, because one of the things I've discovered over the years, church members don't know their neighbors. Sometimes they don't even know their names, let alone what they do, what their likes or dislikes are. Because it's so easy in America to kind of come home from work, pull into the garage, close the garage door, and just stay inside the house. And then you get up in the morning and you open up that garage, you drive off and you go to work, you stay in your cubicle or your office or whatever, you're focused on your projects and things like that. And there's no intentionality in that. Part of this relationship discipleship method here is to get people to see that we want to be intentional about, in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, in the marketplace, wherever that might be, to share the gospel with folks, get to know them, and earn the right to be heard and share the gospel. And so we've got this vision and relationship is prioritized, and this is minimized right now. So this is like the early stages of a church as they get started. After a while, you start adding programming into the church. Again, like I said, programming is good. When I'm talking about youth ministries, when I'm talking about experiencing God classes, that can be type of a programming. When we're talking about community engagement projects that we might do, disaster relief stuff, or I think Garrett and I were talking this last week. One of the things is, Habitat for Humanity. They reached out to me recently and said, "Hey, is there anybody in your church interested in joining us and helping, do what Habitat for Humanity does in the community?" Well, at the time, I'm still waiting to sit there, because one of the things I do is when I get those requests, I sit down in the staff meeting and say, "Hey guys, what do y'all think about this?" And I let them help me understand what that means in this neighborhood. Because sometimes Habitat for Humanity, if you go to Georgia or something like that, they help people get, or South Carolina, they help people get in their homes. It's an opportunity to build a relationship with those people who you're building a house for. And if you can do that, that's fine. But if all they want you to do there is come here and build a house and then move on, that's no different than going to Africa, digging a well, and then moving on. It's a good thing, don't get me wrong. But it's not a part of our vision. Does that make sense? It's not a part of our vision, and it's not a part of this relationship emphasis that we want to have. And again, I'm not saying that we don't ever do those things, but we definitely don't want to start filling our calendar or our programming or timing or emphasis, whether it's missions or whatever, and just doing those things, because those things are easy to do, to be honest with you. We can feed people. We can clothe people. We can give furniture and clothing and all sorts of things. We can educate people and do all sorts of things. But if we're not doing these two right here, the vision and relationship is not driving what we're doing, then ultimately we're going to get to a place where we're going to dry up. And I've seen it so many times where people start off strong like this and they get to a place where, and we'll see here in a little bit where that goes. The last part of that is when a church is really humming along, all four things are just working strong together. And again, this management piece and this programming piece and this relationship piece is driven by the vision. Now, some of these documents that you'll read over here, if you actually go through these books or blogs or articles that are written for these things, sometimes you can look into those and you'll see they'll have timelines on them, like this vision thing right here. This right here might last 6 months to a year. Right here. This one might go from a year to 5 years or something like that. Well, One of the things I like about Bullard is that he's come back and said, this could be 6 to 12 months right here, but a lot of churches, especially if you are bringing the DNA of another church into the church plant, you start compressing the timeline from here and here down. Does that make sense? You don't take the time because that time's already built into what you've done in the other place. So we're not so much looking at time frames like, oh, well, we've been around for 20 years or we've been 15 years. Where are we on this, man? That's why you can't use a date and determine where you are on this map. But this is where the vision is feeding the relationship piece of it, the programming piece of it, and the management piece of it. So when we sit down and do budgets, well, what was our budget last year? Okay, we're taking this some extra. Let's just add 3% across the board. Is that letting the vision drive the budget? Probably not. When you start saying stuff like, okay, man, if I don't use this piece of my budget, they're going to take it away the next year. If I don't use this much, that means next year they're going to take it away. Because how many times have we heard that one before, right? Have you ever sat down and turned in your budget for something, and then the next year you didn't, you turned in a higher budget and they didn't give it to you because you didn't use all your budget the previous year? Is that driven by vision? No, that's what, you're like looking back and now, don't hear me say you can't look back at how money is spent and all that kind of stuff. But the priority ought to be, what is our vision? What do we want to do with our people? And what do we want to do with the resources that we have? And that's what should drive the budget. So you've got all this stuff working together, and what ends up happening is at some point in here, you are attracting new people as you go along this timeline. All right? Man, we just saw what? Just since January 2020, what did he say? There were 31 people up there that became members here. Okay? So you got 31 new people in here. And my question to Alan when we were talking about this several months ago is, when these people come in here, do they hear this? Or are they just experiencing where they came in? Now you might say, what's that got to do with anything? Well, if they come in here because they were attracted to something here, let's just use Awana for example, okay, as part of a program. It's a good program. And it's something that can definitely support the vision of a church. It's something that's definitely able to come alongside of a relationship piece in that process. So Awana is a good program to talk about. Let's just say we brought in a whole bunch of people. Our vision is to, Great Commission, right? Great Commandment. We want to love people. We want to make disciples of the nations. That means make disciples of these people. And so we've done that. We've got them in through Awana and all that. And we're going through this whole process. They came in through here. When they start talking about budget, what are they going to be thinking about? They're going to be thinking about Awana. Man, this is what attracted us here. We need to put more money into Awana. And there might be truth to that. But what if Awana is running along just fine with the budgeting they have? What if we need to shore up another area that we want to focus on, and maybe college students? What if it's about mission opportunities in the community opportunities in the area? What happens if we want to take some of those funds and do that? What happens in a lot of churches, and tell me that if you haven't seen this before, is that you'll have conversations about staff, buildings, programming, or whatever. And when it comes time to start thinking about budgeting money for it, instead of getting an equipping pastor, if a church doesn't have a youth or children's pastor, they might say, hey, we want a children's guy before you get a missions guy in here. Whereas the pastor might think, man, I need someone to come alongside and keep driving this vision. I can't spend all my time doing this stuff. I need someone to come in and take this ball and keep it running forward. Whereas you've got people out here that are saying, no, we need a children's person or a youth person to come in. Or it comes down to the building. Okay, we need to find some new, we need to build a new building or something like that. Let's just say our worship series, that's an old school church, you're in some first steeple, whatever town somewhere, and it's got like 100 seats in those pews. You think, you know what, man, we need to knock out a wall. We need to build a bigger building over here. Well, what tends to happen is there becomes this tension and argument about, no, we don't need to expand this building. We need to have bigger space for our children. And children program, after all, one is how I got in here. So we need to focus on that and provide for that. Instead of, we need to provide a space for people to come and worship. And so both good things, right? But the thing is hinged on, is it feeding on the vision? And most of the time, when this happens, people are thinking more about the programming or relationships more than they are the vision. And so that's why it's important that when people do come into the church, like when they come in and sit through one of those membership classes, they're hearing about our vision. And they're agreeing to when you join this church, you're agreeing to this vision. We need to continually, you'd be surprised how many churches do not, when people are coming in like here, they do not do that. They do not talk about their vision in the church. And this will only, at some point down the road, and it happens in every church, even a church that does communicate vision. But what happens is if you continually communicate the vision, then when we're in a room, there's 100 people sitting in the room and we're talking about our next steps, the question is, okay, that's great. How does that move towards how is it driven by our vision? Everybody's already on the same page. Whereas if we don't communicate that vision, hey, what about our vision? Well, some folks might think of the vision being the children's program, or the worship program, or the missions program, instead of what does it mean to be a disciple that makes disciples, that leads the church to the glory of God. And so we don't want that to be just a catchphrase. We want that to move us. We want that to be something. That's why it's really serious to have a vision statement, something along the lines that you can continually lean into and fall back on. So anyway, with that being said, you can imagine when all of these things start happening, and there are several other ways that can happen. This is what can start happening. Once the vision has been whether forgotten, or even there's some people that can look at this and say, like, remember I talked about the guy who looked at his life and he said, man, I need to get a good job. I need to support my family. I need to get a home. I need to have a good wife. I need to have good, whatever. And all of a sudden, the kids are out of the house. House is paid for. All this stuff is going, and he ain't near retirement yet. What's he going to do? What drives him? What moves the needle for him? And different people, it's going to be different things, right? Well, this is where that person is. They're right now thinking, what is going to get me going at work? What is going to keep me there? Because I don't know how many guys I think I talk to that are like 50 or 55 and go, man, I could probably retire right now. No, you probably don't want to do that. Because I've seen too many of these guys sit around in their lazy boy watching television all day long. And there's just so much jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune you can watch before you start thinking, man, I'm wasting my life here. And so, but this is what happens when we forget the vision. When we're thinking about, when we turn the relationship needle from discipleship to gatherings, we've lost our vision. Okay? Churches a lot of times, here's an interesting thing. Churches many times will take this word. You know what that word is? Okay, what does that word mean? Fellowship. Yeah, it's fellowship. You'll see this word all throughout the scriptures, especially when it's talking about fellowship in the scriptures. All right? But here's the gist of this word. It is not about gatherings. It is not about eating together. It is not about playing games together. It is not about watching TV together or just growing old together. That's not what that is. I have seen in my lifetime where two people who were married for 60 years had been growing apart for decades. All right? Just there's no intentionality in maintaining that relationship. They can just kind of lose it all. And the person, when they're focused, just because they're in proximity to each other doesn't mean there's koinonia there. This word is actually used in some places to where it says, for example, in Philippians 3:10. It's my life verse. But it says, Paul says, my goal is to know him. And again, that word know is a different thing, right? That word know is not about knowledge. It's intimacy. It's the same word used when it says, and Joseph did not know her when he kept her a virgin. Same word is used. It's about intimacy. It's just not about knowledge. It's not about gaining some academic exercise. So there's more to that word than that. But my goal is to know him and the power of his resurrection, the fellowship, the koinonia of his suffering, being conformed to his death. Now, is that kind of koinonia something we strive for? Do we strive for koinonia? Koinonia is such a cool word, and we want to jump on it. Are we looking at the koinonia, the partnership, the fellowship of his suffering? Are we joining that? In all honesty, even if you listen to our prayers, we avoid that. Something we encourage churches to quit doing with us. When they would pray for us, we would hear them all the time say, Lord, protect them. Keep them safe. Now, we appreciate that. I catch myself praying for us. Lord, just take care of us, protect us, keep us safe, whatever. But what we don't want to do is become so avoiding of that we miss out on what God is doing, because it might be that in that difficulty that we find ourselves in, that's when God shows up. So we don't want to just avoid. That's what Paul is saying to the Philippians, because he's praising them for their generosity, their partnership, and all that kind of stuff. And he's saying, man, my goal is to know him and the power of his resurrection. What's the power of his resurrection? It's the power of resurrection, conquer sin and death. I want to know that. And what he's called us to because of the power of his resurrection, be conformed to his death. And in the middle of all of that is the fellowship of his suffering. I want to know intimately. Again, I want to know intimately the fellowship of his suffering. And so what happens, though, is we have changed this word. We have changed this word to gatherings. And people will say, we don't have enough fellowship these days. 1 John chapter 1. Real quick, if you wouldn't mind, if you have your Bible, just open up to 1 John chapter 1. This is, to me, important enough for us to get our heads around, because this is strangled. This is like a kudzu sometimes. If it's in the wrong way, do you know what kudzu is? Y'all know what that vine in the southeast that grows up and just chokes the life out of trees and goes around power lines, and you can't stop it. I mean, you can kill it, but it'll keep coming. It's one of those. It is everywhere. That's what this can be to a church if you're looking at this in the wrong way. 1 John chapter 1, starting in verse 5. This is the message we have heard from him and announced to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Now, listen to what he says. If we say that we have fellowship, if we have koinonia with him, and yet walk in darkness, we lie, and we do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he himself is in the light, then we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus cleanses us from all sin. If we say we have no sin, and he just goes on and on. But what I want us to see here is this, at verse 7. If we walk in the light as he is in the light. Okay, what does that mean? I mean, there's no trick question here. I mean, it pretty much says what it means, but I just want to... If we walk in the light as he is in the light. If we walk with him. Right? We're going along with him. We're doing what he wants us to do. We're obeying his commandments. We're submitting to his authority. His sovereignty over our life. All of those things is what it means to walk in the light as he is in the light. Then we have fellowship with one another. You see the difference there? It ain't got nothing to do with hanging out and being in proximity with each other. That's why Paul, he could be away from the Philippians and have a genuine, authentic joy and love for them, because they were partnering with him. They experienced true koinonia because they were focused on Christ, not each other. Now, again, don't take that. Man, well, I'm just gonna be so gobsmacked with focusing on Christ and all that kind of stuff. I'm going to ignore you. That's not what it's saying. But it's an important thing to get our head around when we're talking about koinonia, because right around here we start focusing more on the relationship, and we change this from being about relationship within the vision of being a disciple, make disciples, be the church to the glory of God, to relationship. And man, COVID has killed us. We ain't hung out in a long time. We need to just get everybody together. There's truth in that. We do need to get together. But that ain't no guarantee to have koinonia. That's just going to be a good social thing for us. And again, those are healthy too. I keep saying, don't read between the lines here. There's nothing wrong with it. But let's don't confuse that with what this is. So you got the vision has been reduced, and it could be, you think, well, I've arrived. I've raised my kids. They're out of the house. My wife and I are happy. House is paid for. Man, we go to Yellowstone one year for vacation, go to Paris the next year. Man, we can travel the world. So we got all these things. We've arrived. So that vision that we had 30 years ago or whatever we sat down and talked about, that's been accomplished. If we as a church ever develop a vision that can be accomplished before we're standing before Him, we got to go back here and start over, because we had the wrong vision to begin with. Because it ain't accomplished until we are standing before Him. Right? So that's what happens here. And you can imagine what happens next. Because of this, there tends to start being a decline in numbers in the church. When we start seeing, and it doesn't just have to be about that, but when people start seeing a decline in the numbers of the church, it usually starts from about right here down. As soon as we lose the vision and we start focusing on these other three, we will start losing influence. And unless all we're interested in is entertainment. I mean, Joel Osteen has proven he can gather a bunch, he can fill a stadium. He can tickle some ears. If that's all we're interested in, that's fine. We started off wrong. But if our vision is to make disciples of the nations, then that vision will never change. In this church, structure document, Great Commission, Great Commandment. Alan comes, he doesn't change the vision, he just words it differently, right? Be a disciple, make disciples, be the church to the glory of God. He just has a little bit more summation to what if you look at the structure document here earlier. So it doesn't change anything. So you get here, but when you start reducing, when the programs begin to take over, when you feel like, oh, we've got to keep growing the programs because that's where we're attracting the crowds. We got to keep pushing this because that's where the excitement's happening. Everybody is, whether it's wherever they came in along this line here, because of whatever program that is, and it could even be the missions program. Because the missions program can drive a church to the place where we're just focused on sending a bunch of people on a mission trip. Right? I know churches sending people on mission trips, and they're in decline. They take 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 trips a year, and their church is declining. Because missions has become their idol. Missions has become the thing. Well, we hear the IMB tell us that we need to send more people. We hear the IMB tell us that we need to put more money towards it and all that. And what are those two things? More people, more money? That's when you start focusing on this end, then you do the vision end. So you have the vision of relationships is reduced. Programs and management's what driving the bus.
Is that where you pretty much get, oh, we're doing this because we've always done it type of attitudes? Or?
Well, that definitely. But it could be, it could be anywhere along this line. I mean, you could have these people here that just came in. We could be doing this for 10 years, let's say. Someone comes in the last year and starts having a conversation about budget. It could start happening here. But definitely this is something about where traditions, again, and traditionally, what are people focused on? It's the activity. It's the processes. It's the systems that are in place. So you've got, and then, you start When you start hearing things like, we got enough money in the bank to keep the doors open for 2 more years, that's when they're here. It's when they reduced these things, and even to the point, I would say, and I've actually seen this, where there's not anything over here. There's not even an inkling of it. It is just, they show up on Sunday mornings and they do church like they've always done it for 30 years. They sing the same songs. They have the same order. They could have pulled an order of service from 1965 and just printed out a copy and handed it over, and no one would have seen the difference. And if you haven't been in those churches, they're out there. They are out there. When I was in Illinois, I had 3 or 4 churches that were singing songs from hymn books that were around before the people, and me being the youngest guy in the room before these people were born. We're talking about back in the 1800s stuff. And so that's what happens here. And right here, there's really little that can be done to save that group of people. Those books aren't going to help. This curve's not going to help. This discussion's not going to help. Because what you have here many times, what I have seen, what you have here is folks who are 70, 80, maybe 90 years old. They don't have the energy to take care of children. They might not even have the resources. They're on a limited income. That church has been paid off. Their pastor, I knew one church up there, the pastor gets $50 a week for coming and preaching. That's their budget, $50 a week. They pay they pay their utilities and stuff like that. But again, they just keep the doors open. And when I ask them, we're in a room, there's 11 people in this room, and I'm just asking the question, how many of y'all live in this town? And one person raises their hand. What's happened is even the people 30 years ago, how many of y'all lived in this town? They all raise their hand. How many of y'all live in this town now? One person raises their hand. They have abandoned the community. They have left the community. They have gone on to bigger houses on another town over, a nicer neighborhood, a nicer school district, or whatever. They have just left this community, and they really don't have any concerns about reaching out to this community. And in this community, they had, in their church, they could open up this church. They could put in a washer and dryer and help out the needy in this. To come down here and do your laundry. We'll sit down and talk with you, get to know your relationships. What? And waste our money and waste our water? Why would we want to do that? I don't know. Maybe for the kingdom of God? I don't know. One lady in that church, and God bless her, she was probably the only one that had an inkling of what I'm talking about here. Sweet lady. She's actually certified in the state of Illinois to open up a nursery, like to watch children. They got plenty of space for that. She wanted to do it. They wouldn't let her do it. Again, it was this callousness towards the community. Well, we open up our doors every week. Why aren't they coming to us? That's actually what I heard. Well, that is a hardening of the heart that none of this stuff, only the Holy Spirit's going to be able to get to that. And typically what goes on here is you just kind of, one church I just had a conversation with a couple of years after I was there, and I just said, guys, listen, I'm telling you right now, I bet you won't make it to the end of the year before you close your doors if you don't change something. And I was wrong. They made it to the first week of February. They closed their doors 5 weeks later. So much pride, so much ego, so much my way or the highway, and the community was the problem, or the association of other churches, we were the problem, or the pastors, the 6 pastors that they got rid of over the last 18 years, they were the problem. It's just they could not, if the pastor could not come in and change things like that, they were trying to figure out a way to get rid of him and get another guy. And that's just what happened. So let's just stop here for a minute. Let's talk about this. You got any questions about this or anything about life cycles of churches? I gave a specific over here about someone coming in on the front end of, or on the back end of the vision. They come in because of a program in the church, and they start looking at a program and all that. Those are some things that, as a church, we would need to sit down and kind of evaluate. Are we putting things before the vision? Are we not spending time sharing people about what the vision is? are we in this room able to sit down with someone who's visiting the church and share with them what our vision at the church is and why that's our vision? And so if not, then we need to do a better job at communicating that, and we need to do a better job of spending time training people what that means for living hope. So, any questions about any of this?
At the peak where you have everything is capitalized, right? Everything is going well. What are good? I mean, obviously, it would be driven by the previous three, but when we say like we're doing management well, and not only well, having emphasis on it, what does that look like? I mean, it could be hypothetical. I'm just
say it again. I got lost in there.
Right. So at the beginning, it makes sense, right? Like everything needs to be driven by the vision.
Are you saying how do you stay here? How do you evaluate this so that you know you're doing this right and staying here? Is that what you're saying?
That's not what I'm asking about.
Okay.
I don't know that too, but like, but you were talking like you start out with vision, right? Vision is almost everything in the beginning,
right?
And then you move to progressively into more emphasis on these other ones as well, doing it well. What like? I guess maybe management. I'm curious more examples of that.
Well, just making sure, for example, management. We talked about like budget and constitution bylaws, church structure documents, whatever we want to call it. What we don't want is this document to ever say if the vision, if as we're here and we're thinking about new things, and we say something like, well, hey man, I think we ought to do blank, whatever that might be. We don't want this telling us we can't.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah.
Now, again, don't hear me say we're going to do something, heretical or whatever, because again, we would our whole thing here, and it's not like one person's going to stand up. I think as a church we should do this. That would be, something where even if Alan as a pastor would come in, he sits down with the staff, he shares some thoughts and dreams and visions and things like that, and we might sit down with elders and deacons and other leaders in the church and start having these conversations. Well, it's not something that would happen overnight. But what tends to start happening here is that we can't do that because the bylaws won't. I'll give you a great example. This is a perfect example. I actually interviewed for a church in South Carolina to be their pastor years ago. Sat down with a man. It was a beautiful area, upstate South Carolina. I don't know if you've been up there, man. It's like rolling hills, mountains, lakes. I mean, it is. They actually have snow more than they do here, and all this kind of stuff. And so it's just a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful area. And so, man, I'm getting excited. I'm up there. I'm walking around the property, and I'm getting really excited. We sit down and we start having conversations, and everything is like clicking. When they ask a question, we're just clicking right along. We're thinking, man, we're lining up. We think that this is going to be, my mind, I'm thinking, man, this is going to be, these people want to move in this direction. One of the things that came up in that conversation is there's a new high school just opened up that year. You can see it from the church property. It's like across the street down the road, just a little ways. Like from here to the car lot, or the auto garage right next door to us. It's just right there across the street. So they said, and that school actually approached the church and said, hey, if y'all want to do anything with our students, let us know. And so he said, what kind of ideas do you have? And I went, man, the old youth minister in me started coming out, and I started thinking I was throwing out all sorts of things, just one right after the other. Well, one of the things I thought of was that many churches at some point in their history, if they have athletes in their school, especially football players, they do a fifth quarter, right? Y'all heard of those, right? After a football game, you invite all the kids so that they don't have to hang out at the Sonic where people are going to get drunk and get in fights and stuff like that. They can come to the church, buy some pizza, let them hang out, invite their friends, play games, watch videos, whatever. I mean, it's just a safe place for them to come. So what I asked for at the end of that conversation, I was going to meet with them again the next day. So I said, listen, here's what I need from you guys. I want your constitution bylaws. I want any kind of documents that you have for, structure of the church and all that, governing the church and all that. So they gave that to me, and that night I was sitting in the room reading up on stuff, and one of the things came up in one of their documents. No teenagers can be on the church property after 10 o'clock at night. I thought, man, there's got to be a story to this. There's got to be history here somewhere. None of them knew if there was a story. They don't even know why that was in there. It was just in the document. And so, guys, y'all do see a problem with this, right? If you're getting excited about a fifth quarter and you see the problem here, you do, what's the problem? Football games don't get over with until right before 10 o'clock, if not later than that. He said, well, what time are you thinking about kids coming over? And I said, whenever the game's over, they just come over. And well, what time do you plan on closing down? I said, maybe 1 o'clock in the morning. He said, just pizza and hang out. They might be gone at 11:30. I don't know, but I'm not kicking them out, And so they were going, well, I guess we're not going to be able to do that because it's in our documents. And they weren't even willing to have a conversation to change that. And that was the beginning of the downward spiral of where I said we were lined up this way. We started moving way apart. And I remember when I left them, I just said, guys, I love you guys. I love what you say your vision is, because I said it that way. I said, but man, I just don't see practically how you guys are going to be able to do it when there's so much in this document that's going to keep you from doing what you think God wants you to do in this place, in this area. I was at the airport in Greenville, South Carolina, at the airport in Atlanta, Georgia, and I landed. I had phone calls from that search committee. Man, seriously, can't you just reconsider? I said, if you'll reconsider your position, I'll reconsider mine. But we can't. And I said, well, then I can't. And I just left it at that. That's one way that can happen, is if that document is written. Now, I don't think Living Hope's document is written in such a way that it will keep you from doing certain things. But it could if it said things like, let's just say we had X amount of dollars in the bank, and the Gay Hearts are over in Indonesia, and they call up and they say, hey man, listen, here's an opportunity, man, we just can't turn away. This is going to be awesome. We just see this as something, and we need X amount of dollars. But yet in our Constitution it says that the church has to come together and schedule, the church has to schedule a meeting and vote on anything above a certain amount of money or something like that. That might be an area that a church, and a lot of churches have this. And that's mainly an accountability tool, and I can understand that to a certain degree. But what happens many times is that budgeting stuff like that, if we all agree it's a good idea, but we have to schedule a meeting, that typically means that document says you got to give people 2 weeks notice before you can meet and vote on this. And then by then, that opportunity in Indonesia is gone. And so that's just one area. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily a bad thing to have. But I do think there needs to be a way to make those decisions in church structure documents or constitution bylaws or whatever, to where you can call an emergency meeting of some sort to vote on that and approve that. So, anyway, any other questions that you might have with this?
Well, you said that was also another question. How do you maintain that going forward?
That's a good question. No, I don't have a black and white, just here's the transcript. Keep doing this. Because every church, how they get from here to here, it's going to be different. They're still going to focus on the vision and all that, but the way we're changing the way we do things. We just put up 3 guys to be elders, right? Even we're changing the way things happen around here. And that will depend in a lot of ways down the road on how a church governs itself, how they structure the Constitution and bylaws, how decisions are made, and all that kind of. And even when you have elders, it's done differently in a lot of churches. You go to John MacArthur's church; they have elders out there, and that is a strong elder rule situation out there. That is not what I see in Scripture. What they have out there. What we're talking about is an elder-led system here, where the elders are just here to lead us, not rule over us. So, and by the way, I just want to tell you that I have enjoyed being a 60-year-old and now looking at little Nathan over there and saying, he's my elder.
You've been waiting to make that joke tonight.
I have been. I've actually told someone, I said, Matt actually has been my elder. And I told Howard today, and I said, you do realize that Greek word is translated geezer in English, right?
So at the top,
Yeah.
what's the idealized thing? Is the idealized thing that things are never getting in the way? I mean, how do you summarize what the top is? Things are, functioning but aren't getting in the way of the vision, or they're four sides of something that are reinforcing each other? Like, what's the...
Well, for me, what I have seen successful churches maintaining this is that they're always evaluating everything they do based on this. Always. When you guys are sitting down as elders and talking about whatever, let's just say you're sitting down and talking about hope groups or deacons or, whatever it is. What is the vision of our church? What do we want to see done that lines up with our relationships, how we do discipleship and everything? How are we going to, as far as programming, the events that we plan? For example, it doesn't have to be an ongoing like a one. It could be, are we going to do a finance seminar? That's an event. That's a part of programming. Are we going to do marriage enrichment? That's an event. That's part of programming. And so even the vision will drive that. Are we going to get someone to come in here from the secular world to tell us how to do our finances or how to do our, even though they're highly acclaimed in their field and all that kind of stuff, or are we going to find people who are talking about biblical marriage? How to handle our finances biblically. And so all of these things, where I've seen this, where they're all, even the documents or the budget and everything is always referring back to what is our vision, what is our purpose, what is our core beliefs, whatever you want to call them, all these things. How does everything we do, how is it reflected here? And so to me, that's the biggest, that's the biggest thing, because once we reduce the value of this, it is a slippery slope going down. And honestly, if this were to take 20 or 25 years to move up, if that's what this would take, it probably takes half that time to slide down, if not less time. Because it just, it's once you start sliding, and honestly, my experience has been a lot of people don't even see it until about right here. I've talked to people who are here or here. I feel like even they'll say, the pastor will say, I think we're probably about right here. But when I've gone into their churches and shared this on a church level, like a Wednesday night in one of the churches in Illinois, and I've shared this, and he comes back, he says, man, they really do believe that we're over here somewhere. And I think we're right here. So the pastor even sees things that the church doesn't see, but partly because, in all honesty, church doesn't want to see that.
I assume too that this doesn't precisely correlate with growth. In other words, you can be over at that, you can be over where you have that circle and still maybe even be growing your numbers.
Yeah, and especially if you have changed this vision. Again, this can be used. When I use the word vision, I'm not just talking about just pick a vision, because like I said, you can pick a vision if you want to attract numbers, right? Let's just do whatever it takes to get people in the building. And you just put on your calendar, hey, in the month of May, we're going to have Voodoo Girls greeting people at the door. We're going to do a lottery. People are going to come in and wherever they see, they're going to reach up under the chair and, hey, you win a prize, and whatever. And so you'd be surprised. There are churches that do that. There are churches that you reach up and you got a Starbucks card for $5 or whatever, and so. The vision, from our context, we want to make sure it's a biblical vision, all right? So it could be any vision, but we want to make sure it's a biblical vision. But you're absolutely right in that their vision could be just about, if their vision is just about numerical growth, which is a lot of churches will view that as success, they will get their eyes off of the Great Commission, the Great Commandment, the glory of God, and all that kind of stuff, and start putting it towards. They want to put their money, they want to put their resources of people and calendar and everything toward, let's do whatever it takes to attract people in here. And then after that, let's do whatever it takes to keep them in here. And many times those churches are moving away from the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it becomes more of a gospel of, in all honesty, the gathering, not true koinonia. They'll use this word, but it won't be the biblical meaning of that word. It'll be, how do we keep everybody together? I mean, think about it. That's the way cults work, right? Try to figure out a way to keep everybody together. And the vision, many times, is around the personality of whatever person is leading that group of people. So, now interestingly, if I want to make sure I get this in because I don't want to take up all our time. What happens when you're over here or whatever, and you recognize where you are? What do you do then? Well, these books and all these processes, but honestly, the biggest part of this, I have seen so many people that have skipped this step. And Alan actually shared a little bit this morning when he talked about when Jesus said that if you want to follow me, you need to what? Repent. If we have gotten to a place like this where we have dropped the vision and we have focused on things that we can do, the programming or the resourcing or the management or things like that, once we start focusing on things that we can do, then we have made either the numbers or the building or the personality or the program or whatever the idol that we have focused on to cause growth. And we need to repent of that. And that doesn't mean we need to get rid of that program. I think most of the time we do. But I don't think it means we need to get rid of that. We just need to realign ourselves up with glorifying God and what His will is for us. And that, typically when that happens, when the pastor or leaders of the church are trying to do that, that's when you will see a huge exodus from the church. You will see people just say, hey, I'm not getting fed around here anymore. In other words, my ears aren't getting tickled. That's the Greek interpretation of that. When someone says I'm not getting fed, that means their ears aren't being tickled. And so they will go somewhere else where there is programming, where there is facilities, where there is an environment that they are more comfortable in than an environment. That doesn't mean that you can't leave a church at some point, because if you're in a sick, dying church, God may want you to stick around. But God also might say, you know what, you need to go find a healthy place somewhere. Because I have actually, overseas, there was a young couple that was on my team in Morocco. And when coming back, he was saying, how do I find a church? I said, man, you got to pray about that, because God might use you in a dying church. He might use you in a hard church. Because this guy could handle it. He's a solid guy. And so he didn't go that route. He found him a good, strong, established church, and that's fine. So I think, again, God might want us to stick around in a hard place to help bring about revitalization or something like that. But typically when you're in this place, some people I like to say, well, in order to move from here to get back on track, you have to kind of move back straight across where you are. And when I read the paper, the documents and stuff, I can see where they're coming from, but that's not, again, to make absolutes is not always true. What I have discovered is that, and this is true on all of these guys, is that as you are going up, it's good to find places where you step back and reevaluate yourself so that you don't start doing this. And honestly, it might be like a revision where you start on another curve. Does that make sense? Wherever you find yourself, even on upwards, where you're moving upward and things are going good, there might come a time when you have to decide, you know what, we need to switch gears. We need to change something. We need to do something different. That means wherever that is on this timeline, you revision and you start another curve up. And so you can imagine how that might look as you for years and decades and even centuries, how that might look over time, where you catch yourself before you start sliding. Because like I said, man, it might take 20, 30, 40, 50 years to get here, but it won't take but 10, 12, 15 to do that. And it can happen, man, overnight. I've scribbled a lot, and there actually is a whole lot more to this. Some of the information in this document that, if you want, it'll give you some things like it'll talk about the issues that might come up. Like, for example, even here, right off the bat, it'll ask you questions like, is this vision generational? In other words, is it just for today, or is it something that you might intentionally be saying, for right now, this is what we're going to do, but we need to address it here? Is it generational? If it's generational, then it can keep going, right? How to be, here's one that a lot of folks, these two both hand in hand. How to be missionary while being the product of missions. Does that make sense? If we're a church plant and we're starting off with vision here, how do we be a missionary while still being a product of missions? Because typically someone is helping us get started if we're going to be a church plant, right? So we're a product of missions. But typically, this is what happens, is that people say, well, man, we can't really be missionary because we're like little spiritual babes in diapers and stuff. They still need to feed us. They need to help us grow and mature and all that kind of stuff. There's always this tension. The quicker that they get it, that they are a missionary as well as being a product of missions, they will accelerate their growth. And then another question is, will the church planting pastor or even the team, are they remaining here long term? In other words, a lot of times church planters will go and plant a church, and then when they get to a certain size or growth, whatever, they encourage the church to find a pastor because they don't feel led to be a pastor. They feel led to be a church planter, but not a pastor. Some guys are planting a church, and they plan on pastoring that church at the end. Some people, like I said earlier, if we were going to be a team, and we're going to go somewhere and plant a church on behalf of Living Hope, wherever that might be, West Bryan out there. If you go in my office, I actually have a map of Bryan, and out in the west, there's like a circle like this over this certain area that is like, there's not really a church footprint out there. And I've driven out there a few times just to walk around the neighborhood, to talk with people, pray and whatever, just to get a sense of, man, is it time? Can we do something and all that? I've talked with people about that. But anyway, what was I going to say? Something about, as a team, we might go out there to help plant that church, but after we might say, hey, we're going to be out here for 2 years. Or at what point the church is able to take care of itself, and then we're going to come back to Living Hope. Or maybe this table says, I think I want to stay out there, and this table might say, hey, I think I want to go back to Living Hope. And that's fine. As long as we're aware of those things, and we're not going to be, there's not going to be a void, because it might be that, for example, Brandy, you might be on part of that team to help develop a children's ministry type thing, right? And if you haven't trained someone to take that over before you pack up and leave, that'll hurt the church plant before they're able to, kind of let you go. And so again, from the very beginning, we want to be reproducible, and so we want to, whatever roles we have, we want to be replacing ourselves with someone else there, which means we want to be investing and training and discipling someone to take over that ministry, so that at some point up here, we can say, you know what, I think my time's here is done. I'm going to go back to Living Hope. So these are just some of the questions that this document over here, as you look through each of these places, because he has like birth, infancy, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, maturity, emptiness, retirement, old age, and then death. Like 10 different areas. So you see, it's like a human being's life cycle. And then he uses those same kind of ideas in a church life cycle. I didn't go through all that because it can be confusing once you start writing all those areas up there and all that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Question. So this is the kind of the model for the broad overview of the church, and you mentioned taking each of those letters and comparing it to the vision, making sure that each of them are supporting and advancing the vision. Right? So I know we're doing that with the M piece, just looking at all the work that's been done with the church structure document. And I know during the budget process this last year, Alan met with the finance team, and he challenged us. He said, hey, let's not just do the budget based on what's been done in the past, like you mentioned before, but let's look at each area that we're budgeting, and make sure that it's lining up with our vision. And are we doing that with each of our ministry teams? And
that was, if you are in charge of developing a budget for your ministry, last year, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there was an encouragement to begin thinking. Alan, I think he communicated to all the ministry leaders to, as you develop this, develop it with the vision, with purpose in mind, not just based on last year's budget. So there's been a process that has started, but again, this takes a little while to fully communicate that and exactly what that might look like. Because again, there might be some folks who their budget is still dependent upon events on the calendar, and they put money towards that. But they might not be aware of how that lines up with the vision. And so I think after some time, it might be that we have to sit down with some and kind of help them see that. And again, don't want this to be this is not a moment of confrontation or anything, but it is a moment to help someone understand what our vision is and what we as a church are trying to do to get to our vision. And so when I sit down with anyone, or I say me, when the elders sit down with anyone and they're talking about the budget, it's their job to make sure that it lines up with the vision, and they will help them understand, or they will pass that off to, like, one of the staff persons might be a liaison over that ministry, and they might be the ones that will help sit down with them and try to help them better understand what that looks like. And in all honesty, that process is going to take, it's going to take a few years, because again, it's trying to turn a big boat around the way things have been done. And the worst thing you can do is just pull the rug out from everybody and say, we're starting over, I don't care if you understand it or not. And that's the worst thing you can do. So sometimes it just takes a little while to do that. Anyone else?
What does it look, I mean, and this may be beyond the scope of this time that we have, but what, I guess what would it look like, or what is your thoughts on, because I know this is something that you've talked about, but for us to come alongside churches in the area and help them with these things?
Yeah, that's...
Not that we're above needing help ourselves sometimes, I'm not saying that, I just mean,
No.
because you brought it up earlier.
No, absolutely. I think, and again, it depends on where that particular church is on this. To what degree, because there are churches that come alongside, there are churches that come alongside, like in Bloomington, Illinois, there was one of our stronger churches came alongside another church, and basically they just took over. They just came in and said, hey, I know this is the way you have done things, but there's a reason. This pastor, man, I love this guy. I love his vision. I love the way he, moves and does things, but he just basically looked at this church and said, there's a reason why you're where you are. He didn't try to fluff it up or anything. He didn't want to waste their time or his time. He said, there's a reason why you're where you are. And there's a reason why you came to us to ask for help. And so we can help you. But here's the way it's going to work. And he just listed out, we're going to develop a team of like 7 people. That's going to be like a leadership team between the 2 churches. 5 are going to come from my church. 2 are going to come from your church. Now right off the bat, you're thinking, whoa, wait a minute now. Why can't we have more say? Again, he would say, there's a reason why you're where you are. We want you to learn, your leaders, to learn from us and all that, and come alongside us in the decision-making process. And so they basically, their constitution becomes their constitution. The way they do their budget becomes the way they do their budget. And that was about 2.5, 3 years ago, and that other church has taken off. I mean, whereas they went from maybe having 20, 30 people in that church, there's like 300 or 400 in there now. And that was just a couple years ago. Just took off. And what that looked like, they even had some of their staff people, 2 staff people, leave that church and become staff in the church they were helping. And they had a handful of key leaders in different places come and be key leaders here. With the idea, not the staff, but the leaders would, like we said earlier, develop, train, reproduce themselves and other people, train them how to do it. And eventually they would back up and let them take it and run with it. And they wouldn't leave until they watched them run with it. So they're still in the process, if I'm not mistaken, they're still in the process of, all that team is still there. But they have stepped back from leading responsibilities to allow those people that have been trained to do the leading. And they're it's almost like what Jesus did with the disciples. At first he went and he did things, y'all need to watch this. And he did things. And then he came on and said, okay, come up here and help me with this. And so they joined him in that ministry. Then after a while, he said, get over there and do it. And he watched. And then after a while, he just gave him a mandate, go, make disciples. And so that's kind of the model they did. Other models have been where the church maintained their name, their structure as far as the Constitution and bylaws and stuff like that, and the team came in and kind of tried to work with them. The more, I'm just going to say it, the more control that the struggling church gives to the healthy church, the better off they're going to be in the long run. The more control they try to hold on to, it's highly unlikely they're going to get anything out of it. And that's just been the case across all of the United States.
So then that kind of supposes, though, that the healthy church has, I don't know if you want to call it a B team or a deep bench, right, for those leadership positions,
Yeah.
to be able to send people from their leadership to go help.
I'll just tell you now, with the staff, Eric said it so he can call me out if I'm lying here. But since I've been here, we've had staff meetings. Every now and then I'll interject something along the lines of, Eric, do you have people on the worship team that you think can lead worship right now? Of course he does, right? They do anyway. Would they be willing to leave the church and do that in another church? Well, if not, then that's the role that he might have to play to help one or two people on the worship team to get a sense of calling to go be a part of a team to go somewhere. So he knows that's kind of the challenge we put in front of him. How do you have people that are capable of leading them? Of course he does. He's got people all over the place, right? Are they ready to go? And that's kind of where he is too. This church has done a really good job in a lot of areas of developing people that can run ministries and programs and things like that. The hard part is getting people to see that there might be a place where they leave Living Hope and go over here to a struggling church, whether all the time or just part-time, over a period of time, and basically take the DNA here, put it in the life of this church until they get to a place where they can either run it themselves and then they can turn around and come back. When the elders are in place, Alan knows the challenge is we need to develop a pipeline somehow of leadership where we can help people who aspire. The scripture does say that for those who aspire to be an elder. So that means there's a want to, right? So what do we need to do as staff or elders to help people move in that direction? And there might be a time when one of those elders say, you know what, man, I feel comfortable enough I could go be the elder in that church. I could maybe even be the lead pastor in that church. And I know when I say that, especially, interim elder, potential future elder, all that sitting here in the room with us are saying, oh man, don't be putting that on me. In Maine, when I got to Maine at New Covenant Baptist Church, when we transitioned like we're doing now from deacons to having elders and deacons, one of my goals was to take that team of 3 and just start preparing them to teach, to lead, to do all the things that they need to do. When I left and went back overseas, one of those elders became the pastor of that church, and he's still there to this day. He was with Nabisco Purina, whatever company, and he traveled all over the Northeast, grocery stores and warehouses and stuff like that. He gave all that up to be the pastor of that church. He felt God calling him. He wouldn't have done it if it was just, well, I guess there's an empty place there, I'll fill it. He wouldn't have done that, but he genuinely felt God calling him to do that. And so, as a church, we need to be thinking not only how do we serve Living Hope, but how do we get Living Hope to a place where we can serve others. And that's just one way of doing it. When a church is struggling and we can come in and infuse them with some energy and enthusiasm, but mainly helping them see what is the vision that's going to help them get back on track and go through that discipleship process and introduce programming that's in line with, even it might be different here. Because the last thing we want to do is have a bunch of Living Hopes. That might be a whole different community. What if that's a Hispanic community? It might be a little different. And so, yeah, that's kind of when you ask that, that's from the very beginning since I've been here, that's a question that's been asked several times in our staff meetings, and that we're thinking, how do we get there? How do we move ourselves in the direction to make that happen? And that shouldn't be anything that scares people. All right? Because we're not going to, I can speak for everybody in that room. Nobody's going to come to you and say, hey, listen, I think you ought to be the lead pastor of the church we're going to plant out in West Bryan out there. And you go, well, I just don't get a sense of that. So I think you need to pray about it, man. Well, I have been praying about it, and I just don't think, you ain't praying right, dude. Come to my office 6:30 every Tuesday mornings. We're going to pray about it some more. And, just manipulate and leverage and all that. That's not what we're trying to do. We want to genuinely help people feel like they can participate in what it means to be a disciple and make disciples and be the church, even if that means being at in another location.
So, quick question. So, because you said that one church that was struggling came to the Healthy Church, and Healthy Church laid it down on the line. This is what happened. Is that typically the way it goes about, or how do you get?
There is no typically the way that goes about. It's all different.
Okay.
Even that way. I mean, that roadmap book I told you about, he will show you a wide variety of ways that can happen as far as a healthy church coming alongside an unhealthy church and helping them. There's all sorts of ways, and there's various levels when it comes to revitalization. Or there's even, it might even be to the point where there are several Revitalize.net. Refocus is another revitalization group out there that we might help this church with funding, provide the resources out of those groups to come and do their revitalization in that church. Now, if they go through that, it's pretty intense stuff. There's no second guessing what you're supposed to do. It's pretty plain. Once you go through the process and leadership, and it's pretty simple what you're supposed to do, and they'll help you see that. Now, the idea then is, are you willing to do that? And, it depends on the members. Sometimes they just look at you and say, man, I just don't understand why we just can't open our doors and have people come in. We provide worship service. Whatever outside of worship service, most of them don't do much outside of the worship service, but except maybe a potluck every now and then. But yeah, there is no typical in how that happens. So it's one of those things where if something like that were to happen to Live in Hope, let's just say someone came alongside us. Like right now, I think Emmanuel Baptist Church here in town is actually doing that with another church right now.
Southern Oaks, I think.
Southern Oaks. The two pastors have been friends for a long time. Southern Oaks just kind of talked and said, hey man, can you help us? And so they just started talking over lunch, over different meetings. They just started talking with each other. And before long, they come up with a plan that they would come alongside and help. And it's not like a hostile takeover type thing like it was up in Illinois. It's nothing like that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's like an equal leadership team, right? 3 from one, 3 from another, or 4 or something like that. And so they're working through that right now, and I'm interested in seeing how that works. So the biggest thing, the way that works, is when, like, we as staff have relationships with other pastors who, once they feel comfortable with us and transparent enough where they know they're not going to be judged if they come and say, "Man, I'm struggling." Because a lot of pastors, I don't know how many times I sat down with lunch over with pastors, and man, they're like waxing poetic about it. I told you about that guy in Illinois who he said, went from like 20 years ago to 180, 185, and now they're down to about a dozen. The last time I met him at Panera there in Champaign, his exact words are, man, we're rocking and rolling. We're shaking the world up. He just doesn't see it. And you can go online and listen to the sermons now and get an idea of why. Because sometimes they're just feel-good messages. He'll read the Bible and start his message, but you won't hear him quote that scripture ever again. He just starts helping people feel good. He spent half of a sermon one time when I went to visit the church just showing slides of his vacation. Thanks for letting me and my family go on this vacation, man. It was really good. Look at this. We were hiking through the mountains and saw there. And, I'm just back there going, you have got to be kidding me. And I know there was a couple during the greeting time. I met a couple that was their first Sunday there. And I just went, no. So that happens. Anything else? Well, just know that when this came up a few weeks ago on our staff meeting, this was something that we just felt like it would be good for us to have an awareness of. To know that there are reasons why conflicts arise in churches many times, and in all honesty, it's because we come at two different places. Well, I think we ought to do this. Well, I think we ought to do this, and it might not be what, neither one of them might not be what we ought to be doing at all. And so I think many times what I try to do when I hear people having these kind of conversations is sit down with them and just try to get them to hear from them, what do they perceive the purpose and vision of the church is, and let them communicate that to me, and then see where we can go from there. And most of the time, if they're willing to have that conversation, what I have found is they begin to understand why we don't do something a certain way, or why we let that tradition go 3 years ago or whatever, and 5 years ago or whatever, and why we're not doing that same thing we used to do 10 years ago. They start understanding that better when they get a gist of that. So if there's nothing else, I think, like I said, these books, if you're interested in this subject, by no means am I suggesting that you have to be interested in these subjects. But this is something that for me, when I sit down and think about what do we want to do in whatever ministry that I'm involved with, is I really do try to figure out how is this going to line up with our vision, and not try to manipulate the vision to make my piece fit, but genuinely look at the vision and say, okay, I need to tweak this. And one of those ways, to be real honest with you, is when I came here, and I just wanted to make sure that, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, I wanted to make sure that we weren't doing mission trips just to dig wells, or hold babies, or build buildings. Because even though all those things are good things, that's not what our vision says. And there's enough people out there that are willing to do good things. Let them do good things. But when I start seeing numbers like, when I start seeing in the church around the United States, 97% of our resources, 97% of our people are serving as missionaries in places where the gospel is already attainable. In other words, you can hear it online, in the neighborhood, from your friends, have conversations and all that. 97% of our missionaries are serving in places like that. 3% are serving in places where they have no access to the gospel. 99% of our budget money is going to those places where the gospel is already accessible. 1% of our budget is going to places where people haven't even heard of Jesus yet. I want us to be a church where we're actually flipping that number around. We're sending more money into unengaged areas, where we're sending people, where we're actually engaged. You heard Jeff and Rachel talk about where they are. There is a place where they have teams serving that is a hard, unengaged place. That's who we're partnering with. That's where we're sending our resources with. It's those people. It's not just, Jeff and Rachel. We can say that because they said we could say their first names, just not their last names, their place. So it's not just because where Jeff and Rachel are, it's the highly Christianized compared to that other place where they are. If you look on the map, go look on a map of where you can see the unengaged people groups, and you'll see definitely distinct color variations on where they live as opposed to where places around them are. And so we're helping them reach that other area. And so that is a distinct difference in as far as us wanting to just take trips, just to go and multiple, of course, COVID has kept us from doing this, but we wouldn't have just sent multiple teams just to do whatever to do in that area, because, like he said, he's got all sorts of people that are just engaging folks with the gospel in their area. But we might come alongside them and do other things with them. It's going to be different based on what our vision is. To be a disciple that makes disciples, to be the church to the glory of God. And so even there, it's going to be tweaked just a little bit. Does that make sense? Okay. If there's nothing else, I'll close us out in prayer, and Eric can shut that thing off. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this night where we can come together and look at how churches can sometimes get away from your plan. Whether we get caught up into just the accolades of doing good things, or just pursuit of things that bring us joy, and not consider what you would have us to do, even the hard things. Father, I pray that we would, here in Bryan College Station, in our neighborhoods and to the nations, that we would surrender to you continuously. Lord, help me. Lord, I know that there have been days where I have been tired and allowed other things and other desires to come into my life, and sometimes we get just caught up in our own personal preferences. Help us to set those things aside, to suppress those things, and to focus strictly in the pursuit of Christ and His glory here on earth. Lord, I'm grateful for each one who's here and the questions they've had. I pray that as we think about this even more in the days and weeks ahead, that we would have conversations, that they would come and talk with me or email me about something, and we would continue to have this conversation. And I pray for those who might be watching this at some point down the road, this recording, that if they have questions, they would come and talk. And we would continue to wrestle with this to make sure that everything that we do as a church lines up with you and your purpose for your church. Thank you, Father, for all that you've done for us. Help us to never take for granted the many blessings you bring our way. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.